Yeah, phosphorus essentially eroding from the mountains, those rocks getting more and more weathered over time until you're left with what we call sediment, right? That those small minerals that from there can enter things like soil or the river or sea beds, and organisms can, they're now small enough that organisms can kind of extract that phosphorus from there. But yeah, the key difference between phosphorus and those other ones in part has to do with the weight of phosphorus. So phosphorus is a relatively heavy element. In fact, if you look on the periodic table, you compare it to nitrogen or carbon, it's a bit further away. So it's a heavier compound, and it tends to attach itself to even heavier elements. And so it produces things like phosphates, which are generally heavy. They're so heavy that they can't be lifted up, evaporated into the atmosphere, and then fall down later. They kind of can't go very far. And so we typically see phosphorus occurring in what we call a local cycle. It doesn't travel very far unless it happens to enter the ocean. So phosphorus is one of these compounds that can have both a global and local cycle. So it's global if once it enters the ocean, but otherwise it doesn't get very far. It doesn't travel very far. Whereas, these others, water, carbon, nitrogen, enter the atmosphere and then can be carried, halfway across the globe. So that they do tend to occur in these global cycles. So let's kind of just go round robin, going through some of these more important talking points. So first of all, we won't focus too much on number 2, I think, for y'all's sake. But what y'all do want to be familiar with are each chemical's importance. And some of these should be obvious. Water, nitrogen in the form of proteins. Without nitrogen, we can't form the proteins and therefore can't form ourselves, products of our genes. But these two are probably the most important points you want to know. What are the major reservoirs for each chemical, and what are the key processes that drive the movement of each chemical through its cycle? So let's go ahead and start with team 1A here. The major reservoir for water, what would you say? Major reservoir. When you think of reservoir, what's that? Ocean, yeah, it's going to be another term that you might see is source versus sink. So a source is where the majority of that water comes from, and a sink can be thought of as where that water goes to. So we often use this terminology of source and sink, describing where something starts off, the source, and where it goes to, the sink. But yeah, the other term for that source would be the reservoir. And that's largely the ocean. What about for carbon? Team 1B, major reservoir for carbon. Yeah, the atmosphere is a big one. And it's not always just one thing. There's another kind of major reservoir for carbon that might not be as obvious of atmosphere. Can anyone take a guess at it? Fossil fuels. And what did fossil fuels used to be? Well, fossil, the term comes from fossil, right? So fossil previously was a living organism, right? We are sources of carbon ourselves. We're a big bank of carbon. And, over time, yeah, just like Dario said, that, fossil fuels, it's hard to think of them as just crushed up dinosaurs, but in part, that is part of it, right? It's living organisms that have been kind of so compressed over time that they're now this abundant source of carbon. We can use that for energy. When we think of coal, It's not necessarily a dead animal, but it's often petrified plant material. It's why, you know, I don't know if this is true across all of the Hispanic world, but in Spain we refer to charcoal just as carbon, just carbon. That's what it is. What about nitrogen? Team 2A, what would you say a major reservoir of nitrogen might be? Yeah, the atmosphere is going to be the biggest one for this. 73% or something like that of the atmosphere is nitrogen. This is a cycle we've actually seen back in Module 5 as well, as you know, plants play a very important part of this nitrogen cycle, and the soil itself does. How about Team 2B? What about phosphorus? What would be a major reservoir for phosphorus?
I would say like the sediment.
Yeah, exactly. The sediment, which came from just the natural earth itself, mountains. So a big abiotic factor, kind of entering from the ground itself, the rocks that are made up of phosphorus. And then we can kind of walk through some of these key processes. And I think the best way to do this is just to sort of describe some of these arrows that we're seeing. So, you know, if you had to describe the water cycle by mentioning some of these arrows or describing the water cycle almost just logically, if you were trying to explain it to a friend, how would you describe the water cycle? How about Team 3? What would you say happens in the water cycle?
Water evaporates.
Yeah.
And moves over land by wind. And then it precipitates over the land and then it runs off back into the ocean.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, sorry, I interrupted you. No, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, yeah, it's just this process of water constantly going from ocean to cloud. Eventually it gets heavy enough that the cloud is going to drop that water and it's going to make its way back, hopefully, to an ocean. And then we water grubbing organisms slurp it up. But then even when we're done with it, it's going back. Yeah, that's exactly the water cycle. And so one thing you might want to think of are these ways that we or other living organisms can sort of impact this otherwise natural cycle. So with the water cycle, there's not much to it, you know, and it's shown in this diagram. Eventually, with climate change, it can be thrown off a bit, or water can, like we saw in Module 5, water can get acidic, and so it can get bad at times. But for the most part, water is one of these cycles that water itself isn't particularly diminishing across. Now, the difference between fresh and salt water, that is important and can change over time, but water itself isn't going anywhere anytime soon. How about the carbon cycle, table 4? If you had to describe this diagram, what would you be seeing? What would you be describing? There's a lot going on, so you don't have to do all of it. But it's getting released, yeah, from what?
The organism.
Yeah, all those animals that you're seeing are kind of barfing out carbon into the atmosphere, right? What's one sort of key difference between this one and the water cycle that we saw? In terms of diet, like what's in the diagram itself? Yeah, there's a big factory here. There's also the organisms themselves. You know, water isn't all that dependent in us. You know, even though we're comprised primarily of water, we tend to release it pretty frequently. If you're a healthy individual, I think it's like 6 to 8 times a day you're expected to release some water. But it's just kind of, we only hold it temporarily. We also hold carbon temporarily, but it tends to exist for a bit longer in us. We are carbon-based organisms. And so we sort of slowly release carbon into the atmosphere. We also release it every time we breathe in the form of CO2. But yeah, that other kind of added influence is right here in the factory. And this is the first arrow we're seeing that isn't based purely off of kind of natural processes, right? And so you can imagine that a world that has relied on this cycle for millions to billions of years, kind of going from atmosphere to plants, which eat up CO2, to animals that eat the plants, which then release CO2, you can see how even the small addition of a slight arrow can throw things off balance. And so this little small arrow is getting larger as we develop, right? So the CO2 that we emit through factory production, but also vehicles, airplanes, boats, all that, are adding to this cycle that has existed for billions of years without us. So one thing to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at this carbon cycle, note the fact that, this might be one where humans might be particularly implicating that cycle. And then it's sort of exemplified or amplified in this cycle, right? The nitrogen cycle. So team 5, how would you describe this cycle here? The nitrogen cycle.
It's off the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Gets fixed by fungus and bacteria.
Yeah.
And then goes to the plants or gets used as fertilizer by humans, runs off into the ocean, and eventually ends up back in the.
Yeah. And yeah, with the factory, we see one arrow kind of pointing into the water here as well. This is another way where we're actually particularly contributing to this cycle because of nitrogen that gets released from producing fertilizers, but also when we use the fertilizer, when water from the water cycle kind of flows through the soil, it carries a lot of that nitrogen into lakes. And one big impact of this is a process that's called eutrophication. So eutrophication is something that isn't thought about all that much, but it is important with relation to our main topic on Monday, which was biodiversity. So eutrophication essentially makes what used to be really diverse looking habitats all fairly similar. And so one result of that is that the animals in that habitat start to look a lot more similar too. So one example that's kind of closer to me regarding eutrophication has to do with what used to be the most diverse freshwater lakes in the world, which were these 3 lakes in Africa: Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, and Lake Tanganyika. Used to be hot spots for biodiversity, and researchers would kind of just study all the different organisms that you could find in these relatively small lakes. But you would sometimes find, where in one lake you might find one species of cichlid, there used to be hundreds to thousands of species of cichlid in one of these lakes. What happened was, with urbanization, you got a lot of introduction of nitrogen fertilizers, and this nitrogen went into the water. And one thing that algae love is nitrogen. So algae started to kind of fill up in these lakes, make the water essentially all green. And so what this did was it actually just screwed with the lighting in the lake. And it turned out that lighting was really important for the biodiversity in these lakes. The fish told each other apart by, if they were deeper in the water, they kind of were more able to see red, whereas if they were kind of more shallow waters, they could more easily see blue, and the fish kind of matched this. But what happened with eutrophication was they couldn't tell anyone apart. And so they just started mating with each other. Hybridization occurred, and a lot of those species became one. The diversity went really down. Some specialists went extinct. And so you ended up now, what was this hot zone of biodiversity essentially became, any old lake system with just a handful of species. Nitrogen can have a particularly big impact on biodiversity. And that's one of the ones we contribute to the most. Can anyone describe what's going on with this lightning? Yeah, so lightning is a kind of cool contributor to the nitrogen cycle. Lightning gets so hot that what it does is kind of the lightning bolt, as it passes through nitrogen that's filled up in the atmosphere, it actually breaks the nitrogen bonds. So nitrogen in the atmosphere exists primarily as, it's not just a single element, but nitrogen in this form, N2. And so what happens is when lightning strikes through one of these molecules, it breaks and forms two single nitrogen atoms, which fall to the ground and enter the soil. So actually lightning contributes to the nitrogen cycle. So it just kind of slashes through all these nitrogen compounds and makes nitrogen atoms because the lightning is so hot, it just breaks the bond apart. So yeah, I had no idea about this until I first saw this nitrogen cycle. I was just like, what's up with the lightning bolt? And yeah, apparently that's what the contribution. Okay, and what about phosphorus? We talked a little bit about this, the fact that it doesn't really go all that high up in the air. So back around to team one, how would you describe the phosphorus cycle? Just looking at this, and kind of the least obvious one, this one, the phosphorus cycle.
It depends a lot on.
Yeah, so like instead of all of this side being sky, there's a cloud there, sure, but most of it is in the form of these sandy rocks, right? So phosphorus really doesn't go all that far. It tends to cycle locally unless it enters the ocean. But even within the ocean, it doesn't tend to go far because it's found within the sediment. Sand might seem really tiny, a single sand grain, but it's hundreds of thousands of times bigger than single compounds of water, carbon, or nitrogen. The phosphorus is stuck within these microscopic rocks, so it falls straight to the sediment and doesn't tend to go very far within the lifespan of an individual. But yeah, it's unique in that it doesn't rely on the air just a little bit, but hardly at all. It relies more, in order to get far, it relies more on water transport there. But yeah, for the most part, phosphorus occurs locally. In this one, you might also notice, just like the water one, there's not as much human contributing factors in this cycle. This isn't to say humans don't have any impact on the phosphorus cycle. A lot of fertilizers have phosphorus in them as well. It's just that the effect we have on nitrogen is so much larger than the phosphorus effect that it's hardly worth mentioning. So we do affect the phosphorus cycle, but not to the scale that we affect the nitrogen and the carbon cycle, which are the two most important ones we affect. So yeah, you want to make sure you're at least familiar with describing these cycles for the last exam and the final. But yeah, that's all we'll talk about biogeochemical cycles for today. what I want, and I've also got in the lecture slides a little bit more information on each of these. So labels for these arrows. But yeah, the main things you want to kind of be aware of are those reservoirs and key processes for each of these. What I want to do now is kind of go through this process we haven't talked about regarding succession. So we mentioned this, I think, a little bit in Module 5 when I told you all about this weird experiment that I still am blanking on his name, MacArthur from the MacArthur Foundation. I described his kind of weird experiment where he took these islands from off the Florida Keys and kind of pesticided away all the animals and insect life on those and wanted to see, okay, what appears now that I have this empty island? Well, you know, even though it's sort of a messed up idea for an experiment, it does sort of mimic what tends to happen naturally, which is this process we call succession. So succession refers to just the natural progression of biodiversity in an area. And, you know, sure, that example is sort of an artificial example of a natural disaster occurring in a given location, but this does happen all the time. So you might have heard of prescribed burnings in forests kind of just northeast of here. There are these pine forests where prescribed burning is implemented, where park rangers and firefighters will literally burn part of the forest because it's an area where that used to happen all the time. So because, you know, our urbanization has sort of messed with that, we kind of have to keep things natural, and part of that sometimes means, you know, burning a forest to make all the animals and plants that are used to that burning a little more comfortable. And so these natural disasters do happen all the time, and what we'll kind of do to better understand this concept of succession is look at one particular case, which is has to do with Mount St. Helens. Does anyone know what Mount St. Helens is? Can anyone tell me? Other than a mountain? Yeah, Carly.
It's a volcano.
Yeah, it's a volcano that erupted relatively recently while people were researching.
At healthcare.gov.
We you know, we were kind of had a good idea of the biodiversity in the 1960s and 70s of this environment, and then I believe in 1980 something, Mount St. Helens erupted, devastated the whole landscape, and so it actually led to this natural experiment, no pesticide needed, to see what are the first organisms to appear after, you know, devastation kind of befalls a habitat. So I'm going to give you all this worksheet that you just want to kind of take a look at as sort of question prompts, and just take a look at these as you're watching the video. We're not going to watch the whole thing, just the points of it. We'll see how gophers are awesome. A lot.
St. Helens is one of the major peaks in the Cascade Mountains. It's an area of outstanding beauty, rich in wildlife. For over 120 years, the volcano has been quiet. But in recent weeks, it's been rumbling. Nobody is sure what to expect. Then, on May 18, 1980, a 5.1 magnitude earthquake rocks the mountain. Within 10 seconds, the volcano's northern flank collapses in the largest landslide in recorded history. It releases millions of tons of magma in a colossal explosion.
This is real. Yeah. This is real.
A cloud of searing gas and rock, known as pyroclastic flow, races over the surrounding countryside. Forests are flat. 4 miles below the summit, an enormous lake is choked with debris. The eruption continues to shoot poisonous steam and ash miles into the air.
It was just, again, astounding is the best word to describe what happened in 1980 here at St. Helens.
The northern slope of the mountain is buried in several feet of ash. Virtually all life is extinguished. 57 people are dead. They include loggers, campers, scientists, and a reporter. Some are up to 13 miles away in areas considered safe. The plume of steam and ash rises miles into the sky for the rest of the day. The drifting ash cloud disrupts air traffic for hundreds of miles. The scale of the destruction is enormous. Across more than 200 square miles, the surge of ash and rock incinerates trees. Thousands of birds from more than 100 species disappear. Billions of insects are gone. Deer and elk are wiped out. This vast area of devastation becomes known as the blast or blowdown zone. Near the crater, ash and rocks from the landslide litter the northern slope of the mountain. It looks like the moon. It's called the Pumice Plain. It's directly below the crater. 4 miles from the volcano, the enormous Spirit Lake is scarcely recognized. The avalanche has lifted its bed more than 200 feet. The surface is smothered in dead trees. Hundreds of species of aquatic life, including insects, amphibians, and fish are killed.
It was black water, and it degassed and bubbled, and it was hot springs that were coming up. If you were to put your fingers into your wrists and wiggle them, you wouldn't even be able to see your fingertips. That's how grossly modified the water was.
Mount St. Helens is now a lifeless jumble of shattered forest, rock, and ash. It's hard to imagine life will ever return. The eruption was so powerful, it altered the shape of the mountain. Mount St. Helens was a typical cone-shaped ball.
That's just to kind of set up what happened in Mount St. Helens, this huge eruption. Kind of mentioned a couple key areas, the Pumice Plain and the Spirit Lake. So now we'll kind of see what happened from there. So this next shorter section, followed by a slide. Yeah, I hate when they add this super dramatic music. It's just every time it's like, why are you?
Mountain's apology arrived soon after the eruption.
Nothing could have prepared me for the sights and sounds that I saw when I got here. It was complete and utter barrenness, and it was no sign of life whatsoever.
So now you'll want to take a look at some of the questions as we see the rest of it.
To survey the mountain, looking for any living things.
It was just intriguing to think about how would life come back to this landscape? What would the pattern be? How would the rate be?
Much of the mountain is still inaccessible, so he starts work in the blowdown zone in an area some 8 miles downhill from the crater.
We flew over in a helicopter very close to the ground. We would have these bumping, twisting flights across the landscape, following the contour.
In the first 3 months, there's nothing but dead and uprooted trees. Then he notices something. Signs of freshly disturbed earth.
Lo and behold, in many locations, brown earth on top of the gray volcanic ash.
Is there something down there? Christopher returns on foot to investigate. There, emerging from the ash, is a tiny burrowing animal. It's a northern pocket gopher.
It was very thrilling.
How can it possibly have survived when nothing else has?
This tiny animal lives entirely beneath the ground, and so when the blast occurred, it would have been safely protected beneath a mantle of soil and may very well have survived in many locations.
Over the following months, he finds more gophers. It appears that life is returning to the mountain just 3 months after the eruption.
Just the last part here, but yeah, looks like gophers are the first ones onto the scene. So to find out more, we're gonna go for a journey. Got that? We're gonna go for a journey. Thank you. I'll pause for laughter. All right, and now we'll watch the last part, which actually corresponds to most of the questions here. But it looks like, you know, they were originally predicting it would take years for life to sort of start to first come back to this area, but in reality, it took about 3 months. They were surprised by the fact that they found these gophers turning up soil. So yeah, let's watch the last part. First, is everyone done laughing at my joke?
The volcano has gone to sleep. The wildlife continues to bounce back. More and more gophers are spreading across the blowdown zone. Lupins are colonizing the pumice plain. And what's happening in Spirit Lake is remarkable.
Lupins were those plants.
The May 1980 eruption obliterated all visible life in the lake. The surface was smothered in a blanket of debris. In the murky water, there was an explosion of bacteria.
There were a couple of species of pneumonia that were described, and also the disease, the bacteria that causes Legionnaire's disease, Legionella. And so many of us working in the lakes in the early days came down with a fever.
The bacteria rapidly consumed the oxygen, making life impossible for any air-breathing organisms, including fish, amphibians, and insects.
We said it's going to be decades and decades before this resembles anything like a typical lake in the Cascade Mountain range. Well, we were surprised because that's not exactly what happened.
Scientists begin routine water studies. It's a unique opportunity to see if and when life will return from the dead. At first, there's nothing. But as the debris settles, the water clears. Life levels improve. Then, 3 years after the eruption, there's a crucial discovery. Microscopic plants. They're phytoplankton, plants that turn sunlight into oxygen. They've been brought in by birds or blown in by the wind. They are the basic building block of aquatic life. Over the following months, as light levels continue to improve, the plankton population grows.
In fact, between 1983 and 1986, 135 different species of these tiny plants had colonized the lake. They provide the oxygen and also the prey for the food web.
Sunlight, oxygen, and food. Several years after its complete destruction, Spirit Lake is coming back to life. Four miles away, the volcano remains quiet. The lava dome has stopped growing. Many geologists think the show is over, at least in their lifetime.
We had the feeling that we had probably seen our last eruption about St. Helens. We knew there was a chance it would erupt again, but none of us were betting on it.
As the mountain sleeps, wildlife bounces back. Even in the most unexpected places, in one of the most devastated areas of the mountain, the Pumice Plain, a gopher is seen. It survived by eating lupin. Lupins provide the food. Gophers enrich the pumice by burrowing their way through the ash. They mix in fresh soil and help new plants to spread.
When you walked around the landscape, it was those islands created by gopher-turned soils that were very green and full of flower and seeds.
The gophers also play another role in helping wildlife spread. Crisafulli finds a salamander in a gopher's tunnel.
What's interesting about the gopher is they create barometers, underground tunnel systems.
Elk are returning to the area, helping to expand this amazing web of life.
When elk move across the landscape, they collapse the tunnels, creating entranceways that salamanders and other amphibians can get access to. Once they get beneath the ground, these are very cool and moist sites that enable them to survive in otherwise inhospitable areas. And the importance of that is allows them to use these underground burrows as stepping stones during hot, dry weather, and eventually to colonize new patches of terrestrial habitat as well as ponds and lakes.
Spirit Lake now teems with amphibians. Fish brought to the lake by fishermen are thriving, a clear indication that the water quality is returning to normal.
What's happened with the fish was actually remarkable. While we don't have a good handle on the total number of fish, we know from our snorkeling and surveys that the population is enormous.
Spirit Lake is beginning to resemble a typical mountain lake. Just over a decade after the eruption, life is flooding back to the slopes of Mount St. Helens. The rate of recovery is far faster than anybody had expected.
Clearly, our understanding of the ability of these organisms to disperse was greatly underappreciated. We found that a lot of our conventional wisdom was just flat wrong.
Then, as life recovers, new threats emerge.
So we'll pause there. But yeah, this is just sort of a little case study in this to describe this process of succession. So here, let me pull up the questions here, but basically we can summarize this as, as this process of mimicking kind of the first instances of life. How did, the first habitats arise, or how do habitats arise after they essentially get totally decimated? So, what was kind of the first thing we saw, the first living organism we saw appear in the area? Yeah, those pocket gophers, right? And so because of them, they were essentially able to alter the habitat in some way that allowed for all these other organisms to arise. And it didn't just affect right where the gophers were, but seemed to affect, life in Spirit Lake as well. We kind of saw this process of how they allowed organisms that they don't typically interact with to start appearing, like the elk, but also amphibians, which are mostly going to be kind of near those ponds. And so we refer in this case to that pocket gopher as a term that your book describes as an ecosystem engineer, or an engineering species. And it seems like almost like a humanized, personified term, but it's because it refers to a special species that is manipulating the environment in some way. So the gophers were essentially doing that. They were, we had this kind of rough terrain. They were able to survive underground, and then they started making these sort of networks. These networks that allowed them to kind of go relatively unharmed. This tunnel essentially extended all the way to these areas that, maybe weren't as devastated by the volcano, where there was already sort of plant life and stuff. And so because they were kind of living over here, these little gophers, they were able to transport these lupins and not, consciously transport them, but they eat the plant and eventually they kind of burrow out and they take it down with seeds in there. And so from there, plant life started to emerge. So they were able to physically alter the habitat in some way underground and make these burrows that allow for new plant life to emerge. With new plant life appearing here, you can imagine why this might be an attractive place for an elk to go. Elk are predated on by wolves and other predators at times. So coming to a place where there's no animals but plenty of food starting to appear, it makes sense for elks to start to appear as well. This highway of tunnels eventually makes its way to that Spirit Lake that they talked about, which at the time was relatively decimated, but wasn't entirely decimated. Interesting thing about salamanders and frogs is that their eggs in certain species can undergo what's called diapods. So you can have dormant eggs kind of burrowed within the ground. And so eventually when the conditions are right again, they'll hatch and you can get frogs and salamanders start to appear. The outside environment might still be too rough for them, still too dry, no water availability, or the water that is available is pretty rank. But they have this humid highway system underground that they can take advantage of. As rain from the water cycle kind of lands here, it gets filtered through the soil, and then the salamanders and frogs have access to water through those tunnels as well. Cleaner water than they would have found at Spirit Lake. So we start to see salamanders and frogs start to appear too. In Spirit Lake, meanwhile, the wind is carrying all this microscopic plant life and bacterial life, which ends up serving as the base of the food chain, the food web that now comprises Spirit Lake. The salamanders and frogs, there's a natural explanation for them arriving. There's a natural explanation for the plants and the bacteria arriving with wind. The fish, that was pretty much just people wanted to fish trout in that lake. We brought those in. But you can imagine that if Spirit Lake were left to kind of just naturally go through this process of succession, you may not see fish there for hundreds, thousands of years possible. It does end up happening naturally. There are cases of fishing birds, of kingfishers or egrets, sometimes eating a fish or dropping it along the way. But due to the sort of isolated nature of that lake, it would have taken a very long time. But yeah, it's kind of just a cool case study that was just shown to describe this process of succession. So primary succession and secondary succession are terms you want to be familiar with, the differences between those. And that distinction is relatively, I think, logical. Primary succession is just the things that appear first. Secondary succession is given another natural disaster that wipes out some of the organisms, what are the second things to appear? So primary versus secondary succession, not to be confused with primary versus secondary consumers. So in this whole process, there are predators out there. So one thing that was just kind of barely mentioned in that video was that in order for the salamanders and frogs to take advantage of this tunnel of highways, they needed the elk to walk over those tunnels and collapse them a little bit. What that collapsing all it does is it makes it so that gophers can't fit in there. Gophers are primarily herbivores, but they will eat salamanders if they're right in front of them. they'll eat frogs if they're right in front of them. So you have this food web start to build just years after this eruption. You've got the plants, whether you're talking about the microscopic ones in Spirit Lake or the lupins on land. Those would be, if we had to put a term to those, what would we call those? Anyone think of a vocab term from this module we would use to describe this type of plant life forming the base of a food web? Yeah.
Founder?
Oh, well, yeah. So they could be a founder species. They're the first ones there. So I'm thinking in terms of a food web, though, you might think of the term primary producer or just producer. So that usually is just that photosynthetic thing. Basically, they can live off of purely abiotic means, meaning they can live off the soil in the ground plus sunlight. They get energy from the soil, but they also make their own. Make other molecules that they need, photosynthesis in this case. Those would be the producers. The thing that eat the producers, what would we call those? Yeah, primary consumer too. And then the secondary consumer would be the thing that eats the primary. They can keep going on, tertiary consumer, quaternary, et cetera, et cetera. But the ones you want to be familiar with are at least just primary versus secondary. So you know that there's this constant buildup. But it all starts with the primary, with that producer, the one who makes their own energy. So those are the main module 6 points. This is the last lecture for today, for this semester. The next time we see each other, you'll probably hate me a little bit because you're taking an exam or something. It's but Monday, right? Yeah, this Monday we've got an exam. Remember, the exam is module 5 and 6. So what's that? That was a 6. No, module 5 and 6. Yeah. So what's that? No, not on the unit exam. But I do want to take some time now to bring it up, just because after that exam is the final. So when you're studying for the final, you definitely want to kind of look back for sure at the reading guides, make note of what were the things we really focused on in each of those modules. You want to read the questions really carefully in the final. So, full transparency, we part of the exam is a list of questions that we have to kind of use for UHD standards. So, I don't get to even make some of those questions. I would improve them if I could. But as you're reading through them, read them carefully. Make note, first and foremost, is the question asking for, is it saying list the incorrect option or the correct option? That's kind of the first step you can be tricked on, because you might see, oh, A's right. That's a true statement. You circle it, and then you realize after the fact that it was asking you for the false option. So really read those questions carefully. Some things I wanted to bring up, just because it's stuff we talked about, but maybe didn't stress the importance of. So the 3 domains of life, can anyone tell me what those are from way back in module 3? The 3 domains of all life. Yeah, eukarya. Prokaryote. Bacteria, which is a prokaryote. And which one? Okay. Archaea. Yeah. And can anyone tell me the difference, first of all, between archaea and bacteria versus eukarya? Archaea and archaea. Yeah. Where? Between archaea and prokarya? Well, first between archaea / bacteria and eukarya. What's the main difference? Yeah. But there are some unicellular eukaryotes. What are archaea and bacteria?
They don't have a nucleus.
They don't have a nucleus, they're prokaryotes, right? They're both prokaryotes, archaea and bacteria. What about a difference between archaea and bacteria? Not as obvious, right? Yeah, so this is one that gets tricky because you might get a question that's what's the difference between gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria? Can anyone tell me? Yeah, it's in the lab. The peptidoglycan, what about it?
Gram-positive has a larger.
Yeah, thicker, and then gram-negative has smaller.
Yeah, smaller. Yeah. So the difference between archaea and bacteria is archaea don't have peptidoglycan at all. So that's where people tend to get hung up on. You see that that peptidoglycan, and you're like, oh no, they have.
Would it be gram-negative?
Well, and what so gram-positive and gram-negative is just to distinguish bacteria within the bacteria domain. It can't be used for the archaea. All right, what about some of the questions, are generally asking you kind of, they are vocab terms that are kind of hidden a little bit more trickily, or they're meant to be a little tricky. So instead of asking you, for a definition of something, they give you a situation and you have to be able to identify what the thing is, like a puzzle. So I've got an example here, so listen carefully. So you see a plant, it's got a separate gametophyte and sporophyte generation. It's got xylem with tracheid cells. The sporophyte is dominant and it doesn't have seeds.
No, I won't ask it.
Hey, wait, yeah?
Huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
A seedless vascular plant. Okay, so what threw you off in that description? Did you hear a term that was like, what is that? There was like the xylem with the tracheid cells. Something I did mention in class, but we didn't really spend all that much time in. So when you're seeing a question like that, so you can see a plant, separate gametophyte and sporophyte generations, xylem with the tracheid, it's sporophyte dominant and it doesn't have seeds. What drew you to the conclusion of seedless vascular plants? Yeah, it doesn't have seeds. Don't be scared when you see like, oh, what is this vocab term right here? If it's obvious to you from it doesn't have seeds, so you know it's seedless. Sporophyte dominant, what are the two seedless plants we've talked about? The mosses and the ferns, right? One of those is sporophyte dominant. Mosses are gametophyte dominant, right? So you only need 2 of those 5 clues that were thrown at you to be able to come across the answer. So if you get stuck on a vocab term, look at the other clues and ask yourself, can I just figure out what this is? Ignore that other. Because sometimes the questions give you almost too much. Okay. If I were to ask you a question like, why did angiosperms, angiosperms are the newest plant group of the newest plant clade. What might explain why they exhibited such high adaptive radiation? So first of all, can anyone define adaptive radiation?
It's speciation?
Yeah, adaptive radiation is just a fancy word for a lot of speciation. It's radiating. So when you think of something radiating, it's maybe you're thinking of light, but if you were to draw it out, it'd be a bunch of lines coming out, right? So the same idea with radiation from a species perspective. And so then what might the answer be? Why did angiosperms, even though they're so early onto the scene, why do they now make up 90% of all plants?
Seeds.
Yeah. So transport of seeds, you said 2 things, right? wind and animals. So are they the only ones that rely on wind and animals for transportation or for the transport of seeds? Well, no, that they do primarily rely on animals for transportation, but not necessarily wind. So remember, what's kind of the closest group to angiosperms? Gymnosperms, yeah. So those also rely on wind to pollinate. But the animals are really what kind of set them apart. They're the flowering plants, and with flower come fruits. And it was just sort of that adaptive technique to get seeds to go far. Other things to know, kind of the crucial traits from each animal branch. So if you remember, once we got to animals, we started seeing a lot of phylogeny, so like the porifera, but we also saw things get closer and closer to us. And as they got closer to us, it was kind of, we saw the development of these traits that kind of got us closer to terrestrial animals like ourselves. So you want to think of, okay, what is the key trait that amphibians develop, that reptiles develop, that mammals develop? And as you're thinking of that, there's some vocab terms you want to be aware of that relate all the way back to module 1. And that's this idea of shared ancestral versus shared derived traits. Raise your hand if you think you've never even heard that before. Okay, good. We've at least heard it. Can anyone define or tell me the difference between a shared ancestral and a shared derived trait? Ancestral is what? From somewhere before, right? Yeah, so, if you were to draw it out in a phylogeny, is that what you were going to say, Evan?
No, I was going to say
the derived trait? Yeah, so, it's a little bit tricky, but no, yeah, you're right. So it's all relative to a group. So if you were to say, name a shared ancestral trait, you'd have to ask, okay, of what group? Because depending on that group, that's telling you, okay, how much further back do I need to go? So if we were talking about mammals, so we've got like humans here and Abraham here. What? So just two different species. And no, that's a tail. And then we have, other descendants from there. We've got a lizard, like but maybe a frog.
bird.
Oh my God! It's like this is a frog. Why? You can tell them their legs. That's frogger. Yeah, thank you. It's a frog that begging for that. But you might ask, what is a shared ancestral trait for a mammal? Then you want to kind of look back and say, oh, okay, it's something that existed before mammals. And so here it might be, the development of forelimbs, so the tetrapod body might be an ancestral trait relative to mammals. What about a shared derived trait? Yeah, hair, exactly. So something that just came here or later. So here or later is shared derived, and here or before is ancestral. That's really the only difference. Other things you want to remember are, which can be tricky, is analogous versus homologous traits and whether those relate to convergent or divergent evolution. You want to, let's see, there isn't all that much math, but Hardy-Weinberg will come back up. using,
I don't even remember.
yeah, using, you know, just one or two questions regarding math. But, you know, it did make up a big part of the early part of this semester. So you at least want to be familiar with what it is, what are those formulas, what are the conditions it operates under. What's that? You can look at, yeah, the IRES will be good practice for the multiple choice. Oh yeah, so it's going to be 60 multiple choice questions, plus the short answer is going to be the exact same. 8, you choose, you have to do the first 4, you choose 3 of the last.
Okay.
And then an extra credit riddle.
What would you say would be the top chapters
so it's made to be evenly distributed. So for the short answer, you can bet you're going to look at something from each module.
Like 10 modules.
10.
Because there's things being
Oh yeah, something like that. So you know, it might be a little bit more of module 5 than module 6, but more or less equal. But yeah, the short answer is definitely going to take some of the highlights of you know, each of those modules. Module 5 again is probably going to be more highly represented. Part of that is to y'all's benefit, to be honest, because that's going to be the stuff that's freshest in your mind. So I kind of want to give y'all a little bit of that advantage. It's not much, but it's a little bit more represented. When it comes to module 6, when you see a description of interactions between 2 or more animals, you want to be able to identify, is that predation? Is it herbivory? Is it commensalism? And sometimes the commensalism one can be tricky because it'll just say, so, you know, what I'll say is, you know, if an interaction involves, you know, one individual, a positive for them and a negative for the other, you want to see in the wording that negative interaction described or the positive interaction described. If you see, oh, this is the benefit to this species, but it didn't mention, or it says there's no benefit to this species, ask yourself, okay, there's no benefit, but did I read a negative for that species? If you didn't, then it's not negative. It's going to be a 0 for that species, commensalism. You want to ask, did I specifically see a positive for one, a negative for the other? If it's vague, it's probably on purpose. The other thing, remember the notation, haploid, diploid, the rare triploid. Can anyone tell me there's something triploid that relates to something from module 5? There's like one thing that is actually triploid. Actually, can anyone tell me what triploid even means? 3 copies of each gene. So diploid means you've got one from mom, one from dad. Haploid is like a gamete. So a sperm cell, an egg cell, you've just got one copy of that gene. Triploid is that rare exception in the endosperm itself. That's the food for the baby plant to be. But, you know, if I were to tell you, you know, for example, that, okay, we have this organism, and when it's a diploid, it's 2n equals 22. I might ask you how many, at 3n, what is it? What's that? Yeah, 33. I mean, this is just a little bit of math, but you're solving for n here. Whenever you see that terminology, it is just a math equation where you solve for n. N is how many different chromosomes are there. Sometimes they're paired up. So this would describe an organism with 11 chromosome pairs. So its endosperm would be 3n = 30. So not something we saw all the time, but it's related directly to that endosperm. Let me see. Okay, if I were to tell you something like another sort of situation that relates to module 6 material, just like the situation where you had to identify the plant and you correctly identified it as a seedless vascular plant, you might get something like, okay, there's this ecologist and his research program focuses on understanding how rabbits help control grass populations in Mount St. Helens. What level of ecologist is this ecologist? And so you might get choices like population ecologist, community ecologist, biosphere ecologist, or ecosystem ecologist. So he studies how rabbits control grass populations. Yeah, community. Anyone think anything else? Yeah, but it's rabbit and grass, right? So yeah, that, and again, I kind of have the rabbit and grass example because people often tend to be animal biased and think, well, grass isn't living, but it is 2 different species. And so when you're talking about interactions just between species, we're at the community level. If I were to ask instead, how water flow affects, fish distribution along rivers, that's an abiotic thing. Water flow is not living. With a species, that would be actually ecosystem. Even though we're talking about one species, there's the non-living thing. Yeah. And then, yeah, those were the main things. Oh, water potential. So we talked about transpiration as this process of water going up the plant. The technical reason that happens is because the water potential is lower on the top of the plant than below the plant. We're always, if you kind of think of a physics term that might come to mind, you might remember vaguely potential energy, right? Rock that's up here has higher potential energy than one on the floor. So usually things that are higher up have more potential energy. With the water potential in a plant, it actually is the opposite, so long as the soil is well hydrated. So if a soil is well hydrated, water potential just means where do you go from more water to less water. And the reason water goes up is because there's always less water at the top of the plant than in the soil that the plant is in. And so the water wants to go where there isn't a lot of water. Just like the process of diffusion, oxygen goes to where there isn't a lot of oxygen. Water moves the same way. So even though it's going down, it's backwards. The lower potential is higher up. And in fact, one thing that's cool that happens in plants, this will be the last thing, is that they can actually respond to that water, that change in water potential. So if we have soil here, a root system, and a plant, this one just has one leaf. Usually it's lower water potential here, higher water potential here, lots of water here. And what's happening at the microscopic level of the leaf is the water keeps evaporating out. So there's no water here. So the water wants to go from high water potential to low water potential. So it makes its way up. Well, as you can imagine, eventually you're going to run out of water unless rain comes or somebody waters their plant. So eventually this gradient from high water potential to low is going to dwindle until you end up in a position where the water potential might be lower in the soil. And so what do you think would happen if the water potential is lower in the soil? Oh, yeah, what's that? Yeah, the stomata are going to close. So this is actually the plant's mechanism to make sure the water, naturally what's going to want to happen, physically what is going to want to happen is the water will want to leave the plant. And so what the plant does is it shuts its doors. And it may not be obvious at first why this keeps water from, why closing the doors up here keeps the water from going down here. But you've probably done this 1,000 times if you're like me when you were a kid. If you ever were messing around with the straw in your water and you kind of plugged it and lifted it up, the water doesn't fall out, right? That's literally the exact same process going on here. The plants close their doors, and so the water won't go out. If you have those stomata open, the water would actually just start coming out of the roots until that potential is equilibrated or the plant withers and dies. So if it's at my house, that's what happens. But yeah, so sorry I kept y'all over, but you never have to hear from me again. You don't want, yeah. But yeah, next time we see each other will be Monday for the exam, and then the final after that. What time was that? Yeah, that Friday, 2:15 to 4:15.